It was the kind of night that seemed to drag on endlessly, a night heavy with anticipation. The clock in Sophia Turner's apartment ticked away the hours as the city outside whispered with the usual hum of late-night traffic. Sophia had always been a creature of habit, an orderly young woman who loved her routines, and tonight was no different. She just finished a light dinner, a quick phone call to her mother, and a few messages to her friends. Everything in her life was calm, serene, as if nothing could disrupt the peace she had created for herself. "I'm just going for a walk," she told her roommate, smiling as she grabbed her jacket. She was known for those spontaneous late-night walks, where she would clear her head after a long day of work, her favorite way of unwinding. There was nothing to suggest that this night would be different, nothing that could hint at the horrors waiting just beyond the corner. She stepped out into the cool air of Salt Lake City, pulling the collar of her jacket higher against the biting chill. The streets were quiet at this hour, save for the occasional car passing by, its headlights cutting through the darkness. As she walked, her mind wandered. Sophia had always been one to think deeply, and tonight, as she strolled down familiar paths, she couldn't help but reflect on her life, her job as a graphic designer, her recent promotion, the excitement that awaited her in the coming months. There was so much to look forward to. But as the minutes passed, something began to feel off. The night air felt colder, the shadows stretched unnaturally long, and there was an eerie stillness in the air that seemed to cling to her every step. She turned a corner, passing by a small park. For a moment she stopped, looking up at the dark trees swaying gently in the wind, their branches creaking as if they were whispering secrets. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw a figure. At first, she thought it was just another person out for a late-night walk, but as the figure came into focus, she felt a chill crawl up her spine. It was a man standing motionless in the middle of the street. His features were indistinct in the low light, but there was something unsettling about him, something that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Sophia hesitated, her instincts telling her to turn around and head back to her apartment, but she didn't. She was no stranger to the night, no stranger to walking alone. She brushed it off, chalking it up to an overactive imagination. But the figure didn't move. Not a single step. It was in that moment, a split second of awareness, that Sophia's world shifted. She started walking faster, her pace quickening as the figure still stood there, watching her. She could feel his gaze even though she didn't dare look back. Her mind raced, her heart pounded, but she couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that clung to her. She crossed the street to avoid him, but the figure didn't move, didn't follow her. He was still there watching. Sophia's breath came in shallow gasps, and she felt a strange urgency building inside her. She had to get back. Had to get home. By the time she reached the next corner, the figure had vanished. She looked back over her shoulder, but the street was empty. The only sounds now were the distant hum of traffic and the occasional bark of a dog. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, convinced it was just a moment of paranoia, the kind of thing that happens when you're alone at night. But she didn't stop walking. Her steps were faster now, her thoughts too scattered to make sense of everything. She needed to get back to her apartment, where she would be safe, where she could lock the door and forget about the strange feeling that had come over her. She arrived home shortly after, her heart still racing. She unlocked the door and stepped inside, the warm glow of her apartment lights offering comfort. She heard the sound of the television in the living room, her roommate still up watching a late-night show. "Hey, I'm back," Sophia called out, closing the door behind her. Her roommate Linda didn't respond right away. There was a slight delay before she poked her head around the corner, a puzzled expression on her face. "Everything okay?" Linda asked, eyeing Sophia closely. Sophia nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure she felt okay. "Yeah, just needed some fresh air," she said, forcing a smile. "I'll be in my room, just need to unwind for a bit." But even as she retreated to her bedroom, her mind remained on that figure in the street. The way he hadn't moved, the way he had watched her. She tried to shake it off, telling herself it was just the darkness playing tricks on her. After all, Salt Lake City wasn't a dangerous place. She had walked these streets countless times before, never once feeling fear. She got ready for bed, but sleep wouldn't come. Her mind kept replaying that moment, everything felt so real, yet so strange. As if something had happened that she couldn't explain. But she told herself it was nothing. Nothing to worry about. The next morning, when she didn't wake up for her morning call with Linda, the feeling of unease returned. Linda knocked on Sophia's door. No answer. She knocked again, harder this time. "Sophia? You up?" She entered, and what she found would be something she could never forget. The room was empty, but Sophia's phone was still on the bedside table. The door was locked from the inside, and there was no sign of a struggle, no sign that anything had happened at all. Sophia Turner had vanished. The police were called. An investigation was launched, but as the days went by, the case grew colder. No witnesses came forward. No one had seen anything. Not a single person had any idea where Sophia had gone. And then whispers began. Whispers that spoke of the police knowing more than they were letting on. Whispers of secrets buried deep. But the most unsettling question remained: what had really happened to Sophia that night? As the investigation stalled, one question loomed larger than the rest. What had she seen that made her run so fast, so urgently on that dark street? What had she feared, and why was she silenced so suddenly? And who, if anyone, was hiding the truth? The days stretched into weeks, and still there were no answers. Sophia Turner's disappearance had stunned the community, but as time passed, it began to feel like the case was slipping into oblivion. The police had initially promised that they would leave no stone unturned, but now the investigation seemed like an afterthought, buried beneath other cases, other priorities. Sophia's family, devastated by the lack of progress, fought to keep her name in the public eye. Her mother, Ann Turner, held press conferences and spoke out relentlessly, her voice hoarse from weeks of crying. "My daughter didn't just disappear. Someone knows what happened to her," she would say, her eyes filled with a desperate resolve. "Someone is hiding the truth." But despite her efforts, the media attention faded. The once bustling investigation seemed to be stuck in the mud, unable to move forward. That's when rumors began to emerge. Whispers that pointed to something more sinister. It started with a conversation Ann overheard at a local diner one evening. She had been sitting at the counter, nursing a coffee and trying to hold herself together. Two police officers were talking nearby, unaware that she could hear every word they spoke. "People have been asking too many questions," one officer said, his voice low. "It's not worth the trouble to dig any deeper into it." The second officer nodded. "Yeah, the less we know, the better. Some cases you just let them go. It's easier that way." Ann's heart dropped. She had never heard police officers talk like that. The words were simple, but the implication was clear. Someone in the force didn't want this case solved. Someone wanted it buried. It wasn't long before Ann's suspicions grew. She started hearing stories from people in the neighborhood, stories that didn't add up. A neighbor, Greg, told her he had seen a police car parked near Sophia's apartment building on the night she went missing. When he tried to mention it to an officer, he was brushed off. "Probably a patrol car on routine," the officer had said, but Greg didn't buy it. He knew what he had seen. Then there were the inconsistencies in the official police reports. The timeline of events didn't make sense. Sophia's phone records showed she had made a call just before she disappeared, but the details surrounding that call were vague and unconfirmed. The investigators had brushed it off as nothing more than a mistake, an accidental dial. But what if it wasn't? What if someone had been trying to reach her? Ann pressed the issue, demanding answers, but the more she pushed, the more the police seemed to shut her out. Every request for new information was met with silence. And when she started talking to other families whose loved ones had gone missing under similar circumstances, she found a pattern. Cases like this one, where the police seemed to know more than they were letting on, were not as rare as they seemed. Her suspicion turned into certainty. The investigation into Sophia's disappearance was being deliberately mishandled. Someone within the department was protecting something or someone. But who? And why? And wasn't the only one who began to feel the weight of suspicion. A former police officer, Thomas Miller, who had left the force under unclear circumstances, reached out to Ann. He had heard about the case and knew something didn't feel right. Over a cup of coffee in a small, dimly lit cafe, he shared what he knew. "I worked on a case years ago, something similar," Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We were told to drop it, to leave it alone. Too many people in power involved. The higher-ups, they didn't want it getting out." And listened, her heart pounding in her chest. "Are you saying?" He nodded, his face grave. "I'm not saying this is the same thing, but I've seen how these cases get handled. There are always people pulling strings behind the scenes. They silence things. They make sure the truth doesn't come out. But why?" And asked, her voice shaking. "What could be so important that they'd let my daughter's case go cold?" Thomas hesitated. "I can't say for sure, but I suspect it has to do with the people involved. Whoever is behind this, they have a lot to lose if the truth comes out." And left that meeting with more questions than answers. The feeling of helplessness that had been creeping up on her now settled into a gnawing ache. The investigation into Sophia's disappearance was being stifled, and no one was telling her why. Worse, she began to fear that Sophia wasn't just another missing person. There was something about her case that had made it dangerous to pursue. In the meantime, Anne's own investigation had uncovered some troubling facts. Sophia's last known whereabouts, the place she had walked to that night, was only a few blocks from a local bar, the Raven's Nest, a dive spot known for its shady clientele. Sophia had never been the type to frequent places like that, but one name kept coming up. A man named David Caldwell. David Caldwell was a known associate of a local gang, a man with a history of violent crime. He had been in and out of jail for years, but there were no records that suggested he had ever had any direct contact with Sophia. However, according to several sources, he had been seen watching Sophia on a few occasions. She had always dismissed it, thinking he was just another person she'd encountered in passing. But now, as Anne dug deeper, the pieces began to fit together. David Caldwell was also known to have connections within the police department. Some of his associates had run-ins with officers who were well known in the community, officers who had been seen near the site of the crime. Were they involved in some way? Or was someone covering for Caldwell, keeping him out of the investigation? Anne couldn't ignore the mounting evidence, and the more she learned, the more it seemed that her daughter's disappearance wasn't just a case of a woman vanishing without a trace. There was something more sinister at play, and it was being covered up. As Anne made her way through the maze of lies and contradictions, she couldn't help but wonder, who in the police department was truly looking for Sophia? And who was protecting the man who might hold the key to her disappearance? But as she dug deeper, a shocking revelation came to light that would leave Anne, and everyone else, rethinking everything they thought they knew. And it would be something that would shake the very foundation of the investigation, revealing a truth more chilling than anyone could have imagined. The shock came in the form of a letter. It arrived on a gray Tuesday afternoon, slipped quietly into Anne's mailbox. The envelope was plain, with no return address. Her hands trembled as she opened it, revealing a single sheet of paper, typed in neat, precise letters. I know what happened to Sophia. Meet me at the old church on Maple Street. Midnight. Come alone. The note was unsigned, but the message was clear. Someone knew something, someone who was clearly trying to get her attention. But who? And why now, so long after Sophia had vanished? And couldn't help but feel a surge of hope, the first in weeks. Maybe, just maybe, the truth was still out there. But there was also fear, a gnawing unease that kept her awake at night. She had come so far in this pursuit of answers, but now, faced with an anonymous message, she wasn't sure who to trust anymore. Could this be a trap? Was someone playing with her emotions, leading her deeper into the web of lies that had already ensnared her? Still, her instincts told her this was not something she could ignore. This could be the break she had been waiting for. She had to go. That night, and found herself standing in front of the old church on Maple Street, a crumbling relic of a bygone era. The large, faded building loomed before her like a ghost, its broken windows and sagging roof a reflection of the decay that had seeped into the case she was chasing. She glanced nervously around, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The street was deserted, the only sound the rustle of leaves in the wind. She hesitated. Should she call the police? Should she bring someone with her? But she knew the answer. She had no one to trust now, not even the law. The few officers who had shown any sympathy for her were either too afraid to act or too deep in the cover-up to help. If she was going to find the truth, it would have to be on her own. And stepped into the churchyard, her footsteps echoing in the quiet. The church doors were ajar, and as she approached, she felt an odd chill in the air, as if something was waiting for her inside. She pushed open the door and entered cautiously, her heart racing with each step. The interior was dark, the air heavy with dust and the smell of aged wood. It felt like a place abandoned by time itself. Suddenly, a voice broke the silence. I knew you'd come. And spun around to find a figure standing at the far end of the church, silhouetted against the dim light. A man. She couldn't make out his features, but his voice was familiar. Who are you? She asked, trying to steady her voice. The figure stepped forward, and the dim light revealed a face Anne knew all too well. It was David Caldwell. Her stomach twisted. How could this be? The man she had been investigating, the man she had suspected of being involved in her daughter's disappearance, was standing before her, calm and composed. He wore a dark jacket, his hands buried in his pockets, and his expression was unreadable. You know what happened to her? Anne's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of all the weeks of grief and frustration she had felt. David's lips curled into a thin smile, but it wasn't a smile of comfort. It was cold, distant. I know more than you think, Anne. But first, you have to understand something. Anne's heart pounded in her chest. Understand what? What could you possibly have to say that would make sense of all of this? Her hands clenched into fists at her sides, every muscle in her body tense, ready to react. David took a deep breath as though weighing his words carefully. You think you know the truth, but you've only scratched the surface. The truth is, your daughter's disappearance was never meant to be a mystery. It was planned. And I was only a small part of it. Anne's mind spun. Planned? What are you talking about? David took a step closer, his voice dropping to a low, almost conspiratorial tone. Sophia was never just a random target. She was caught in something much bigger than you realize. There are people, powerful people, who needed her gone. And the police? They're not your friends, Anne. They never were. Anne's breath hitched in her throat. What are you saying? Who are these people? What do they want with my daughter? David looked away as though hesitating. I can't tell you everything, but I can tell you this much. The police aren't going to solve this case. They're too deep in it. They've been covering for the people who orchestrated Sophia's disappearance from the start, and felt as though the floor was giving way beneath her. How do you know all of this? David met her gaze, his expression more serious now. Because I was part of it. I didn't have a choice, Anne. You have to understand that. Her head spun. This was everything she had feared. A tangled web of corruption and betrayal, where even those who should have been fighting for justice were complicit in the crime. But why? Why had he gotten involved? What was his role in all of this? Before she could ask another question, David's face darkened. There's a lot you still don't know. But if you want to understand the full picture, you need to follow the next clue. It's in the basement of this church. There's a locked door. The key's hidden under the third pew on your left. Anne's pulse quickened. What was behind that door? What did David know that he was finally willing to share? But as she turned toward the basement stairs, she froze. A sudden sound, footsteps approaching fast, echoed in the silence. David's eyes widened in alarm. You have to go. Now. And didn't hesitate. She ran, her heart pounding in her chest. As she fled into the night, she could hear the distant sound of sirens growing louder. The truth was closer than ever, but so were the dangers that lurked in the shadows. Anne's breath came in ragged gasps as she ran through the streets, her mind reeling from everything David had just revealed. The world she thought she knew, where the police were the ones who upheld justice, was now shattered. David Caldwell, the man she had once considered just a suspect, was telling her that the police were as guilty as anyone in the disappearance of her daughter. And the church, the secret basement, was the next step in uncovering the truth. But there was no time to stop and think. She ducked into an alleyway, her heart racing. The sirens were getting closer, and panic threatened to take hold of her. What had she just walked into? How much of the story was David telling the truth? Was he trying to help her, or was this another game in the tangled web of deception? She had to keep moving. There was no turning back now. After a few moments, Anne pulled herself together, forcing her thoughts to focus. She couldn't afford to make rash decisions. She knew one thing: she had to get back to that church. The basement, the locked door, it was the only lead she had. She couldn't let fear stop her from finding out what had happened to Sophia. Making her way to a secluded part of the city, and finally found a quiet moment to catch her breath. She had to figure out where she was going next. But as she glanced around, she realized someone was following her. A shadowy figure was trailing her every move, just out of sight. She quickened her pace, her mind racing. Could it be the police? Was someone sent after her? Or was it someone else entirely, someone more dangerous? Her pulse quickened as she turned down another alley, hoping to shake off whoever was behind her. But just as she thought she had evaded them, a figure stepped out from the darkness in front of her. It was Detective Thomas Miller. His eyes were cold, but there was something about the way he looked at her that made Anne's stomach drop. He had always been one of the officers who seemed genuinely sympathetic to her cause, and now here he was, standing in her way, his hand resting on the gun holstered at his side. "You're in deeper than you think, Anne," Miller said, his voice calm but filled with an undercurrent of something darker. "You don't know who you're dealing with. This isn't just about Sophia anymore. It's about something much bigger. You need to stop this now." Anne's mind reeled. "What are you talking about? You're the one who's been lying to me. You're all part of this." He took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. "I didn't want this for you. I didn't want you involved in something that would destroy you. But you're already in too deep, and now you're a target. If you think David Caldwell is your ally, you're wrong. He's not who you think he is." And took a step back, her pulse racing. "You're one of them, aren't you? You're working with him. You all covered this up, Sophia's disappearance. The whole thing was a setup." Miller's face twisted with something between regret and anger. "You don't understand, Anne. You don't know what's at stake here. This goes beyond just one girl. There are powerful people involved. People who will do anything to protect their secrets. He was talking in circles, and could barely make sense of the words. All she knew was that he had been lying to her this whole time. The police, the investigation, they had all been a charade. You're playing a dangerous game, Anne, Miller continued, his voice low. And if you continue, you won't make it out alive. I don't want to see you get hurt. Please, walk away. But Anne shook her head, her determination rising. No, I won't stop. I will find out what happened to my daughter. Before Miller could respond, a car pulled up beside them. The door swung open and another figure emerged, someone Anne never expected to see. It was her old friend, Detective Sarah Lawson. Sarah's eyes flickered between Anne and Miller, her expression unreadable. You should listen to Thomas, she said, her voice unusually stern. He's right. You're getting yourself tangled in something you can't escape. Let us handle this. We're trying to protect you. And felt the weight of the situation crash down on her. She had trusted Sarah. She had trusted all of them. But now the walls were closing in. She had no choice but to trust her instincts, and they were telling her that something far darker was at play here than anyone was letting on. Enough, Anne said, her voice shaky but resolute. I'm not going anywhere until I get answers. If you're with them, then I'll find out the truth without your help. Before either of them could say anything more, Anne spun around and began to run. The car, the two detectives, it didn't matter anymore. She needed to know what was in that basement, and she couldn't let anyone stop her now. With every step she took, Anne's mind raced. Who could she trust? Where could she turn? She had a sinking feeling that David's words, those cryptic warnings, were far more serious than she had realized. The police were not just unhelpful, they were dangerous. And they weren't the only ones. And finally made it back to the church. It looked just as desolate as before. She approached the door and was about to go inside when she froze. A shadow shifted behind the cracked door, and someone stepped out of the darkness. Her heart skipped a beat. It was David. But there was something off about him now. His face was pale, his eyes wild. They know, he whispered, his voice trembling. They know you're here. You have to go, now. Before they get to you. Anne's heart skipped a beat. Before she could react, the unmistakable sound of sirens filled the air. Anne's heart raced as the sound of the approaching sirens grew louder. The air around her seemed to thicken, each second dragging on as if time itself was conspiring to trap her in this nightmare. David's warning echoed in her ears, but she barely had time to process it. The sirens, the flashing lights, and the oppressive fear began to blur into one overwhelming sensation. Something was coming for her, and she didn't know how much longer she had before it would catch up. David grabbed her arm urgently, pulling her toward the back of the church. We don't have time, he hissed, his grip tight but frantic. His eyes darted around nervously as though he could already sense the presence of the law closing in on them, and could barely keep up as he dragged her through the shadowed alleyways behind the church. Her legs ached, and her mind raced faster than her feet could carry her. Where were they going? How could she escape all this? Her thoughts kept circling back to one thing, the truth. The basement, the police cover-up, David's strange behavior. Nothing about this situation made sense. But she had no choice but to follow him now. Every instinct told her that finding out what had happened to Sophia, what the police had hidden, was the only way out. They rounded another corner, and David stopped abruptly, looking both ways before ushering her down a narrow passageway that led to an old, abandoned building. The walls were cracked, the windows boarded up, and the air inside felt stale and suffocating. As they stepped inside, the noise of the outside world seemed to disappear, leaving only the eerie silence of the dilapidated space. Anne's pulse hammered in her ears. What are we doing here? She whispered, but David didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the far end of the room, where an old, rusted door sat ominously in the corner. We're safe for now, David muttered, almost to himself. But we don't have long. They'll be looking for us. You have to understand, and you're in over your head. This isn't just a missing person case anymore. It's bigger than that. Anne's mind spun, still reeling from the events of the last few hours. She wanted to scream at him, demand to know why he was suddenly acting so strange, but she held her tongue. The walls were closing in, and all she could do was wait and see what he had to say next. David paced the room, his hands shaking. You don't know everything. You don't know what's at stake here. There are people who will stop at nothing to make sure the truth stays buried. And now they're onto you. They know you've been digging around. That's why they're coming for you. And stood motionless, her thoughts in chaos. She thought back to the messages, to the cryptic clues, to the inconsistencies in the police reports. She had no idea who David really was or why he was helping her now, but something in his eyes made her trust him, for the moment. A sudden crash from the building's entrance made Anne's blood run cold. She barely had time to react before she heard voices shouting, echoing through the hallways. The sound of footsteps approaching grew louder. "Get down?" David hissed, yanking her down to the ground as he crouched beside her. He pulled a dusty old tarp over their bodies, hiding them from view. The world outside seemed to hold its breath, as if everything was waiting for something to break. The voices grew louder, closer. "She's in here somewhere," one of the men said. His voice was familiar, and felt her stomach twist. It was Detective Miller. "I told you she wouldn't make it easy," another voice said, one and didn't recognize. David's grip tightened on her arm as they both lay still under the tarp. The sound of footsteps grew nearer. They were right outside the room now. "Check the back," Miller ordered. "She has to be in here." Anne's pulse raced and her breath caught in her throat. She could hear the sound of a door creaking open as the men searched the building, their heavy footsteps thudding across the creaky floor. Every moment felt like an eternity. Anne's body was stiff with fear, every muscle aching from the tension. But then, as suddenly as it had started, the footsteps stopped. There was a moment of complete silence. David's eyes met Anne's in the darkness beneath the tarp, his expression grim. He slowly removed the tarp from them, signaling for her to stay quiet. "They've gone," he whispered, though there was no certainty in his voice. And didn't move for a long moment. The quiet around them felt unnatural, as if it were too calm. What if they were just waiting for them to slip up? She needed answers. And the longer she stayed in hiding, the less likely she was to ever uncover the truth about what happened to Sophia. "They'll be back," David said, his voice low. "They know you're here. They know we're getting closer. The truth is buried in. The only way to get to it is to take the fight to them." Anne's heart was pounding in her chest, her mind caught between fear and desperation. The weight of the decision pressed heavily on her. What if David was right? What if the only way forward was to confront the people who had buried the truth? But who could she trust now? Was David truly on her side, or was he just another piece in the puzzle of lies? "I have to go back," she said quietly, her voice filled with resolve. "I have to go back to the church. There's something there, something they're hiding. I can't stop now." David's face darkened. "You're playing with fire, Anne. You have no idea how deep this goes. But if you're determined, we need to move fast. They won't stop until they silence you." And nodded, her decision made. It was time to face whatever came next. There was no turning back. As they prepared to leave, a new voice, distant yet clear, suddenly pierced the silence from behind them. "Leaving so soon?" It was Miller's voice. And froze, a chill crawling up her spine. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. "Leaving so soon?" Detective Miller's voice was dripping with cold amusement, the sound carrying down the dark hallway toward them. Anne's heart skipped a beat, but David's face tightened, his eyes darting around for an escape route. Anne's breath caught in her throat. She had been so close to discovering the truth, but now it seemed like the walls were closing in around her. There was no way out. "Stay calm," David whispered, his voice low and urgent. He motioned for Anne to stay behind him as he edged toward the old door they had come through earlier. "This isn't over yet. We still have a chance." And nodded, her body trembling with a mixture of fear and determination. She had come this far, there was no turning back. She had to face whatever was coming head-on. Miller's footsteps grew louder, echoing in the empty space. "I know you're in there. You think you can run from this, but you're too deep in now. We know everything, Anne." Anne's mind raced. How much did they know? Had they been watching her all along? The room felt smaller, the air thicker, as though the building itself was suffocating her with its secrets. David reached for Anne's hand and pulled her with him toward the back exit. But before they could make it, the door at the far end of the room swung open with a loud creak. Two uniformed officers stepped in, blocking their path. Anne's breath caught in her chest. There was no way out. Miller stepped into view, his eyes cold and calculating. "You really thought you could expose the truth? You thought you could bring down people who've been untouchable for years?" David took a step forward, his jaw clenched in frustration. "It's not about bringing anyone down, Miller. It's about the truth. People like you don't get to cover it up anymore. People deserve to know what really happened to Sophia." Miller smirked, his eyes narrowing. "The truth? You want the truth?" He chuckled darkly. "Well, here's the truth, Anne. Sophia was never meant to be found. Her death wasn't some tragic accident, it was a warning. A warning to anyone who got too close to what we've been protecting. And now you're in the way. David stepped in front of and protectively, his body tense, ready for whatever would come next. But Anne's mind was spinning. This wasn't just about Sophia anymore. This was about a whole network, a web of corruption and lies that stretched far beyond the small town she had thought she knew. "You're too late," Miller said, his voice dripping with finality. "The game is over." Anne's chest tightened. She couldn't let it end like this. She couldn't let them silence her or bury the truth once and for all. With a sudden rush of adrenaline, she pushed past David and faced Miller directly, her voice trembling but firm. "You think you can scare me into silence? You think you can intimidate me into forgetting everything I've uncovered? I'm not afraid of you, Miller. And I'm not backing down." Miller's eyes flashed with surprise, but then the smirk returned, this time with a colder edge. "You should be afraid, Anne. Because what comes next will make everything you've seen look like child's play." The officers took a step forward, but before they could react, David grabbed Anne's hand and yanked her toward the back door. The officers lunged, but they were too slow. "Run!" David shouted, and they both darted into the night, leaving the dilapidated building behind. The cool air hit Anne's face as they burst into the street, but there was no time to breathe, no time to think. They had to keep moving. They ran through the darkened streets, every shadow seeming to hide an enemy, every corner a potential trap. But they couldn't stop now, not when they were so close to the truth. David didn't look back, but Anne couldn't help herself. She glanced over her shoulder as they reached the edge of town, and for the briefest moment she thought she saw a figure in the distance, watching them. Miller? One of his officers? It didn't matter. They had to keep moving. Finally, after what felt like hours, they stopped by a small hidden car in an alleyway. David quickly started the engine, and they sped off into the night, the sound of tires screeching against the pavement echoing in their wake. As they drove and couldn't shake the feeling that their journey wasn't over, not by a long shot. They had uncovered part of the truth, but there was still so much more to reveal. So many questions left unanswered. She looked at David, who was driving with a tense focus, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. David's eyes flicked to her briefly before returning to the road. "We go to the one place they never expected us to go. There's someone who knows everything and they'll give us the answers. But it won't be easy. And they won't just let us walk away." And nodded. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. And with that, the screen faded to black. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more gripping tales of mystery and suspense. Your support means the world, and we've got plenty more coming your way. Stay tuned for the next chapter, and remember, no secret stays buried forever.